But the more I studied the subject, the more I said, look, I can't find the papers that show this is true. There are hundreds of papers that assume it's true, but almost none that actually demonstrate it. Okay? Now, again, the fact that no one has showed something to be true doesn't show that it's false, though it should make you suspicious. Okay? Now, and then when I started asking people further, so what am I missing here? Tell me where the evidence is. I can't find it. Well, when I talked to a lot of other economists, they would just give me a definitional argument. They say, look, error is random because it would be irrational. People would be irrational not to have random error. And I would say, and how do you know that they aren't irrational? Well, what do you mean? The definition of rationality is that people don't have random error. That's a circular argument. So you're saying that on the one hand, if people are rational, they'll only have random error, and on the other hand, the reason that we know they only make random error it would be irrational if they did. That's actually a very poor argument. Okay, so then I went over and talked to political scientists, wanted to see what they would have to say about it, and what they would generally say is, I said, well, why are you so nervous? And they said, well, the reason we believe it is because economists told us it was true. Okay, so the economists have a definitional argument for it, which is not really an argument at all, and political scientists were often taking it on the economist's word, so that was a problem. Okay, so looked then like there was very little evidence in favor of this key assumption. Right, so, but all right, so then I said, well, let's see whether we can test for this. Let's see whether we can actually go and look at the facts and find out whether or not it's true. Right, so this brings us to the question of how is it that you would test for systematic error or systematic bias? Right, so something's called systematic error bias. How would you actually test for that? How would you look in the world and find out whether or not errors, in fact, were random or biased? Okay. Well, there's three main methods, so I'm just going to go over the first two main ones briefly, and then I'm going to spend a lot more time on the one that I actually used. All right, the first and the simplest one can be called the method of objective quantitative comparison. Okay, so the idea here is step one, we go and ask a bunch of people what they believe. Step two is we find out the fact. Step three is we compare people's average belief to the fact. And if the average belief is approximately equal to the fact, then it looks like errors are indeed random. On the other hand, if the average belief is substantially different from the fact, then we say, at least here we have an example of systematic error. So one example you might try is the budget. All right, let's first go and ask people, how do you think the federal budget is spent? All right, so what are the main items in the federal budget? What percentages go to different items? Ask them this. Then you can go over to the Statistical Abstract of the United States, go to the right page, and you can find the truth. Right, the truth is a number. Right, so maybe like 21% is the true number. You can then compare the number that people gave you to that 21% and see whether they are approximately equal or not. Okay? When you apply this method, the results are very clear, and that is that there are large systematic errors on important questions. Right? So it's not just that people are off by like 0.5 percentage points, and you can notice this because there's lots of observations. Rather, there are enormous gaps. People often think that items that are very small are in fact very large, and vice versa. And again, these are important questions. So like how the government spends its money. That's trillions of dollars. It's not like I had to search around for some obscure fact about dog catching or something like that. Okay, so what are some of the main facts? Well, Americans sharply overestimate the level of foreign aid and welfare spending. Okay, so for example, there was one study that was done by the Kaiser Family Foundation that asked people to say which of the following things, out of which of the following budget categories, gave them 6 budget categories, said tell me the 2 that are the biggest. Right, foreign aid was actually the most common answer. Right, when in fact foreign aid is about 1% of the budget. It's a very small amount. Right, so Americans sharply overestimate the level of foreign aid. They imagine that it's basically the biggest item in the budget, when in fact it is one of the smallest. The same thing goes for welfare spending. And so welfare spending, again, a relatively small amount of the budget, maybe about 10%, depending on how you define it, and often seen as one of the very largest items. On the other hand, they greatly underestimate spending on pensions and health care. Okay, so very few people seem to realize Social Security is actually the biggest item in the budget. So that is actually much bigger than welfare and foreign aid. In fact, it is many times larger than foreign aid, and yet is much less likely to be believed to be a large item in the budget. And again, the same thing goes for healthcare. Healthcare is a very large chunk of the budget, and yet it is seen as being a much smaller part. Okay, so looking at some basic facts, then you can see that people's beliefs are very different from the facts, and it's not that some people happen to be wrong and others are wrong in the opposite direction. Rather, people tend to be wrong in the same direction. There are lots of people who overestimate the size of foreign aid. Very few people underestimate it. Right? Similarly, there are lots of people who underestimate the amount of money we spend on Social Security. Very few people who underestimate it. Okay. All right, so that's one method. You can apply it to a lot of different questions. However, one of the main problems with the method of objective quantitative comparison is that it's very limiting. Right? There are a lot of questions that are interesting but can't easily be answered just by opening up a reference manual. Okay? Some can. Okay? But what can you do for questions that are more complicated? For example, the question of which trade policy has better overall effects for the economy, free trade or protection. Right? Now, you can't just go to the Statistical Laboratory of the United States, flip to the right page for free trade, and then it says the answer to that question is free trade. Okay? So generally, reference manual will not tell you that. This doesn't mean, though, that all views are equally good. Rather, it is just a more complex question where people are less comfortable going and putting a definitive answer in. Nevertheless, there can be arguments and facts on one side that are a lot stronger than you have on the other side. Okay, so this brings us to a second method that has often been used, especially in political science. It's called the method of enlightened preferences. Okay, the idea of this method is that we get a group of people and we give them two different surveys. Okay, so it could be the people in this room. All right, so the first thing that we give you is what's called a political IQ test. This is a test of your political knowledge where there are right and wrong answers. Okay, the kind of answers that you can look up in a reference manual. Okay, so these could be questions like how many states does the United States have, how many senators does each state have, what are the number of terms, name as many Supreme Court justices as you can. Right, so you can go and give people a test of their political knowledge. One thing we know is some people will score quite a bit better than other people on this test. Okay, so that's step one. Right, so essentially this is a political IQ test. Okay, step two is we then ask you about your policy preferences. We ask you which policy do you think is better for the economy, free trade or protection. We ask you, should we raise taxes and spending, reduce tax and spending, or keep taxes and spending about the same? We could ask you about whether or not we should legalize abortion, right, or delegalize abortion. We could ask you about whether we should legalize marijuana. We could ask you about whether we should return to prohibition of alcohol. We can ask you any number of questions about public policy. Right, so that's step two. Right, so notice these are questions where a reference manual will generally not tell you what the one right answer is. Okay. Then, once we've got these two pieces of evidence, these two facts, what we can do is statistically estimate your policy preferences as a function of your political IQ. So essentially what we're going to go and see is, do people with high political IQs want different policies than people with low political IQs? Okay. Now you may say, well, maybe people with high political IQs have higher income or have some other advantage. So the next step is, all right, that's possibly true. So let's go on and add statistical controls for that. Let's go and compare people with high incomes and different political IQs and then see whether or not their policy preferences are different. Right? And of course, we could add on controls for anything else that was bothering you. We could have add-on controls for race, age, gender, on and on. Right? So we could go and list all kinds of other control variables, things where you might say that a person who knew more might want something different based upon what kind of a person they were. Right? You might think, for example, that if you were poor and knew a lot about politics, you want high taxes, and if you're rich and knew a lot about politics, you want low taxes, for example. Okay. So second step then is to estimate preferences as a function of your political IQ, controlling for any non-cognitive factors. Right. Then the next step is to simulate what public opinion would look like if everyone had a perfect score on the political IQ test. Okay. So once we know what people with very high political IQ scores want, we can then say, let us go and figure out what the world would look like if everyone had that really high score. In fact, we can figure out what the world would look like if everyone had a perfect score. So if everyone was able to correctly answer all the questions that we asked about politics, what policies would then prevail? Okay. Now, the result of applying this whole process is that, once again, there are very large systematic effects of a higher political IQ on policy preferences, which, again, goes contrary to the miracle of aggregation. Right? So in the miracle of aggregation, the result would just be that people who knew more, this might change people's, it might change the spread. There might be less randomness. It might be more predictable to say what someone who knows a lot more is going to want versus what someone who less wants. But you would not expect there to be these systematic differences. Right, now, a nice example of the political IQ method at work is this question from a book by Scott Althaus, which asks, which of the following two positions is closer to your views? One, we need a strong government to handle today's complex economic problems, or two, the free market can handle these problems without government becoming involved. Okay, so the actual breakdown of the answers, so what people really said, 62% said more government, 38% said less government. Okay. Then what was done here is the enlightened preference method was applied, where they went, and what Althaus did is he simulated what people's answers would have been if their political IQ were different.